The last time the HOA tried to bully me, I told them to get lost. Now they're back, with a menacing grin. Comment below where you're watching from, because tonight, you won't believe how far desperation can go. They demand I join their board or face the consequences. Little do they know, I hold more power than they could ever imagine. The rush of ocean waves sounds distant now, overshadowed by the pulsing echo of the HOA representative's demand still rattling in my head. I close the door, my heart pounding as if it's trying to match the resonance of the knock that disrupted my evening. When I glance around the compact living room, I notice the memories packed onto the shelves, framed photos of family trips to this very shore, souvenirs from various local fundraisers, and mementos marking my journey from an ambitious small-town kid to a respected political figure in the state Senate. My phone buzzes on the counter. Missed calls from colleagues, texts from staffers wanting to schedule tomorrow's meetings, and a reminder about a pending bill. Before addressing the whirlwind outside, I gather my breath. This home, perched at the edge of the vast Pacific, has always been my refuge. But tonight's confrontation leaves me uneasy. Until now, I've tried to keep my political identity quiet in this neighborhood, not wanting to overshadow ordinary interactions with the gravity of my title. Yet it seems that the local HOA, particularly its board, has grown a bit too comfortable throwing its weight around. Their invitation to join them was never truly a request. It felt more like an ultimatum cloaked in polite words. My phone buzzes again. This time it's my old friend Thomas, a neighbor I've known since college who lives 2 houses down. He'd seen the commotion earlier and is sending me a text that reads, "Are you okay? They came by my place too. Something's off." Thomas has always been level-headed, someone who can calm any storm, which is why his concern makes me more unsettled. Leaning against the arm of the couch, I read it again. He wouldn't typically use that tone unless he'd sensed real danger. A few months back, he mentioned the HOA had tightened its grip on community rules. Petty fines for lawn decorations, mandatory repainting of fences that were already in fine condition, even threats to those who questioned their tactics. I remember joking that they'd never try that nonsense on me, not knowing they'd become so brazen. Clearly, this is no ordinary group of residents calmly ensuring property values remain stable. They're more like a power-hungry committee, eager to run the neighborhood as their personal fiefdom. I recall an incident from just a week ago. My trash can was left out by the curb after pickup because I had a late-night Senate event and couldn't bring it in until the next morning. That minor oversight led to a sharply worded notice taped to my door, threatening a hefty fine if I violated community standards again. Normally, an HOA might give a gentle reminder or a courtesy warning, but the note was practically drenched in hostility, suggesting I'd become their newest target. At first, I brushed it off, focusing instead on the legislative responsibilities piling up on my desk. Yet that notice was only the beginning of their intensifying attempts at intimidation. Now, with the direct confrontation earlier, it's obvious they intend to escalate. The main voice behind the demands is a woman named Regina Whitmore, the HOA president and a local real estate broker rumored to have bigger aspirations than her title suggests. She's been known to rule with an iron fist, punishing even the slightest infractions. I've heard she's been eyeing developments along this beachfront for a lucrative new project, something about turning this stretch into a high-end resort area under her firm's banner. According to local gossip, she's missing one crucial ingredient: political leverage. That's where they believe I can be of use. But I've never entertained the notion of endorsing questionable deals or legislative favors. Now it appears she's determined to pull me under the HOA's umbrella, by force if necessary, to gain that advantage. Scrolling through my phone, I see emails from constituents, messages from my staff about tomorrow's committee hearing, and a reminder about a conference call with the governor's office to discuss upcoming infrastructure funding. The threads of my political life are still humming in the background, even as I stand here in my personal crossroads. I respond quickly to Thomas, telling him I'm fine but that we need to talk in person. I want to hear his perspective and see what else he's noticed. Some time ago, Thomas hinted that certain board members were extorting residents into paying various administrative fees, funneling the money into an untraceable account. If that's true, they're stepping beyond the boundaries of petty rule enforcement and into the realm of fraud. Before heading over to Thomas's place, I decide to revisit a piece of my past for reassurance. There's a small wooden chest under my coffee table, stuffed with old photographs and official documents. Atop the stack is my father's portrait, taken right in front of this beach house decades ago, the day he and Mom decided to purchase it as a family getaway. My father, a man of unwavering principles, believed that doing the right thing sometimes meant standing alone against a tide of opposition. He was the one who instilled in me the values of civic duty and integrity, encouraging me to serve the public good. This house, in many ways, is a testament to that moral grounding, and I'm not about to let a handful of bullies in pressed suits turn it into their personal bargaining chip. I lock up, making sure the front door is secured, then walk down the sandy path leading to Thomas's property. The neighborhood is strangely quiet, though porch lights illuminate the neat row of houses. It's not until I approach his driveway that I realize how tense the atmosphere actually is. A couple of windows I pass are dark, unusual given that those residents typically keep their curtains open to enjoy the moonlit sea. Is it my imagination, or are people retreating, perhaps afraid to stand up to the HOA's intimidation? Thomas sees me coming and steps outside, closing the door softly behind him. His brow is furrowed, his expression somber. He points to a stack of papers on his coffee table, visible through the front window. Apparently, they're fines and violation notices he's collected over the last 2 months. Ridiculously petty citations for things like inadequate edging of flower beds and failure to place an HOA-approved fence design. You got the same visit, right? Thomas asks quietly, glancing around as though expecting eavesdroppers. They came by with this folder, all official-looking, told me I should sign a non-disclosure agreement before they discuss the terms of joining their board. He rubs his temple. I've never heard of an HOA using NDAs like this. It's beyond unusual. I nod, a wave of anger surging through me. They tried cornering me, too, claimed it'd be in my best interest to become their newest member. Regina wants something, she's not even hiding it anymore. I can't fully articulate the knot of tension twisting in my stomach. On one hand, I want to blow the whistle on their tactics immediately, leverage my position as a state senator to alert local law enforcement or even higher authorities if needed. On the other hand, I worry about the potential political fallout. The possibility that this local scuffle could overshadow bigger legislative battles I'm fighting. These are the types of moral dilemmas that test the steel of one's resolve, but they're also the kind of problems my father taught me to face head-on. Thomas motions for me to follow him inside. His house is similar to mine in layout, reflecting the typical coastal architecture of the area, though it has a much more lived-in vibe. Piles of books on his sofa, half-finished knitting projects courtesy of his partner who's currently out of town. On the coffee table lie the aforementioned documents from the HOA. Some are labeled with official stamps, others look more like intimidation letters laced with legal jargon. Thomas pours us both a glass of iced tea, offering a small respite from the tension swirling between us. He looks at me with genuine concern. This is getting out of hand. They've threatened to put liens on people's homes. The board says they have every right to enforce community standards, but those standards keep expanding, and anyone who questions it gets slapped with more fines. I scan the documents quickly. One letter stands out. It warns Thomas that if he fails to comply with immediate adjustments to his backyard fence, the HOA will move to foreclose on his property. The fence, from my casual observation, is perfectly fine. This is clearly strong-arming. My blood boils. But I keep a tight lid on my anger. She's trying to squeeze money out of everyone, I say. But there must be more. She wouldn't push so hard without a bigger motive. Thomas takes a seat, a worried expression crossing his face. I overheard something at the last board meeting. I went because I was going to file an appeal for a violation, but they abruptly kicked me out. As I was leaving, I heard Regina talk about future commercial projects along the coastline, something about needing support from the local planning commission. She said she'd secure that support one way or another. I meet his gaze, a chill crawling up my spine. The pieces start to snap together. Regina is positioning herself for a major real estate development, but local regulations likely require environmental reviews, zoning changes, and other bureaucratic hurdles. Having a state senator in her pocket, someone to smooth over these regulatory issues, would be the crown jewel in her plan. Alternatively, if that senator won't cooperate, intimidation might be the next best approach. Outside, the ocean wind rattles the window. A sudden gust, or maybe the subtle reminder that we're standing in the eye of a storm. My mind races with potential strategies. I could alert my staff and launch a formal inquiry, but I'd risk tipping Regina off. If I go public with my status now, she might back down, or she might double down. I need more information. Thomas, do you think we can gather evidence, speak to neighbors who've been bullied, compile everything into a case? His expression brightened slightly at the idea. Yes, definitely. A few people trust me enough to speak up. They might not trust the authorities, but they'll talk if it's for you, and if they know your intentions. Swallowing the last of the iced tea, I consider the delicate balance of revealing my identity. So far, I've kept a relatively low profile here, focusing my political capital elsewhere. Yet it might be time to use my authority for something that hits very close to home, literally. All right, I say, we do this carefully. Let me see if I can talk to a friend in local government, maybe get some background on Regina's dealings. Thomas nods, his relief palpable. We have to be cautious. I don't trust them. If they find out you're investigating, they might escalate. I grin wryly, remembering the menacing looks I received earlier. They can try, but we're going to gather every piece of evidence we can, and then we'll see who's really running the show in this neighborhood. A short while later, I head back to my home. The boardwalk is quiet except for the gentle rush of the waves. My phone vibrates, a staffer reminding me of tomorrow's legislative briefing. The contrast between the demands of my political office and the sudden crisis here is jarring, yet it also feels like the two worlds are about to collide. As I step onto my porch, I realize I need a secure place to store whatever evidence I gather. My father's old lockbox in the living room might do. Mentally, I'm already mapping out how I'll interview the neighbors, record their statements, and cross-reference the HOA's rules with state regulations. But before I can settle in for the night, there's a new envelope pinned to my door. The HOA's seal is on the front. Inside, a terse letter. Due to your refusal to comply, an urgent hearing has been scheduled at the community hall next Friday. You are required to attend or face penalties. My jaw tightens. They've wasted no time pressing forward. I can't help but wonder if they realize the magnitude of the fight they've started. For a fleeting second, I even feel a twinge of pity for them, not because they deserve it, but because they're stirring a hornet's nest they're not prepared to handle. I tuck the letter into my pocket, deciding to use it as another piece of evidence. As I lock the door behind me, I'm more resolved than ever. The next phase will involve methodical planning, unveiling hidden motives and exposing the truth behind Regina's tyranny. The waves outside crash with more force now, as though nature itself anticipates the storm that's about to break. By the time Friday arrives, the entire neighborhood buzzes with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. The hearing at the community hall looms large, and the air feels thick with tension. In the interim days, I've spent countless hours meeting discreetly with neighbors, each one sharing stories of harassment, exorbitant fines, and underhanded threats. Some have recordings, photographs, or archived HOA emails that confirm what Thomas and I suspected. Regina and her inner circle have systematically abused their power to impose ridiculous regulations, collect inflated fees, and push reluctant homeowners to the brink. Their endgame? To dominate the entire beachfront, clearing obstacles to a massive development scheme that would transform these quiet shores into a profitable enterprise for Regina's associates. Neighbors I'd never spoken to before approached me in hushed tones, recounting how they were too fearful to come forward individually. One woman, Linda, broke down in tears, describing how the HOA forbade her from displaying a wheelchair ramp for her elderly mother without proper design approval, then penalized her hundreds of dollars per day until she removed it. Another resident, Mark, had a raw wound in his voice as he described being threatened with foreclosure over an unapproved shed in his backyard, despite the fact that the structure had been built long before the new rules took effect. These stories, heart-wrenching and infuriating, cemented my resolve. I quietly gathered every piece of documentation. At the same time, I used my connections as a state senator to discreetly look into Regina's background. While I kept my rank hidden from most neighbors, a few needed to know, especially those providing critical evidence. When I ran the name Regina Whitmore through some legal databases, I discovered red flags, allegations of misconduct in her real estate transactions, a couple of civil suits settled quietly out of court, and rumors tying her to a political action committee that favored extreme development agendas. These discoveries made it clear that she wasn't merely an overzealous HOA president. She was a shrewd operator with bigger ambition. The day before the hearing, a confrontation occurred. I'd been walking along the shore at dusk, clearing my head, when Regina approached me with two of her board members flanking her. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored jacket, wearing a smile that never reached her eyes. "I hope you've reconsidered our proposal," she said, her tone dripping with forced politeness. "Joining our board would be a wise move. It's a great opportunity to support community growth, especially for someone with your background." Her emphasis on the word background didn't escape me. She was making it known she'd done her homework. There was a veiled warning in her eyes. I'd seen it countless times in politics, but never in my own front yard. "I'm afraid I can't accept," I answered calmly. "I don't believe the board's intentions align with the community's best interests." Her nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. "That's a pity. I was hoping you'd be smart about this." Behind her, the two board members exchanged smug glances, as though they already knew something I didn't. Regina leaned in slightly. "You might want to watch yourself. The HOA has a right to enforce all manner of compliance. You wouldn't want your beach house to face problems?" I bit back a retort, unwilling to reveal my hand so soon. "We'll see how the hearing goes," was all I said. Regina's smirk told me she found my response amusing, possibly even naive. She turned sharply and walked away, her minions in tow, leaving behind the faint echo of her footsteps on wet sand. That night, I couldn't shake a lingering sense of dread, something about the way she spoke, her supreme confidence in how events would unfold. It put me on edge. Thomas had texted me earlier, "Be careful, hearing is a setup." He'd heard rumors the board intended to introduce evidence of chronic violations on my part, building a case to evict me from the community if I refused to comply. The thought of losing the family beach house under false pretenses was infuriating, but I forced myself to remain calm. If Regina tried to manipulate the hearing, I'd be ready. The hall was crowded when I arrived. A hush fell as I entered. Some people eyed me with sympathy, others with a guarded sense of curiosity. On the makeshift stage at the front, Regina sat in the center, flanked by her board members. A typed agenda lay on the table, listing various items like landscaping rules and funding for community events. But near the bottom, in bold letters, was the reason for the large turnout: hearing regarding non-compliance of beachfront homeowner. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience as the meeting got underway, reviewing mundane matters before arriving at the agenda's final point. Regina gestured theatrically for silence. "Our last topic concerns repeated violations and the refusal to join our community board," she began, her voice sweet but commanding. "We cannot have residents who disregard our authority, particularly those who think they're above the rules." Her gaze met mine pointedly. She launched into a tirade enumerating a list of trumped-up charges: unapproved exterior lights, landscaping that didn't match the HOA's palette, minor structural alterations made without permission. Each accusation was petty or false, but she delivered them as though reading from carved stone tablets. She claimed that I had consistently disrespected the HOA's code and that I owed the board substantial financial penalties. A wave of tension seemed to roll through the room. I noticed Thomas in the audience, looking worried but determined. When Regina finished her scripted speech, she invited me to respond. I calmly stepped forward, clasping a manila folder that contained the evidence collected from neighbors and from my own investigations. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak," I said evenly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "However, this hearing seems to be addressing the wrong issues. The HOA has been systematically abusing its power, extorting residents and threatening them with foreclosure for trivial or fabricated violations. I have documents, letters, photos, and testimonies from fellow homeowners that point to a pattern of harassment." A hush fell over the crowd. Regina's expression stiffened. I caught a flicker of panic in her eyes. She tried to maintain her composure, laughing dismissively. "Those allegations are outrageous. The HOA follows strict guidelines. Perhaps you're confused or you've been misinformed." I set the folder on the table. "I'm not confused, nor am I misinformed." I began to detail some of the more egregious examples: the excessive fines slapped on senior citizens living on fixed incomes, the refusal to approve medically necessary ramps, the shady charges for non-existent infractions. As I spoke, heads nodded in recognition, and a low rumble of agreement built up among the audience. It was clear that many of them had experienced or witnessed the same troubling behavior. Regina's face darkened. She glanced nervously at her board members, who fumbled through their notes. My heart soared with a surge of confidence. But then something unexpected happened. The overhead lights flickered. A sense of unease seeped through me. The room plunged into partial darkness for a split second before the light steadied again. There was a tense hush as everyone tried to process the glitch. Regina cleared her throat, trying to regain control. "Regardless of these baseless claims," she sneered, "this hearing is about your violations." What came next felt like the entire night accelerating into chaos. One of Regina's allies rushed to the stage, holding a smartphone aloft. He whispered frantically in her ear. Regina's eyes widened, then narrowed. She grabbed the mic and announced, "Everyone, we just received an urgent message. There's a fire near the beachfront properties. We need to evacuate the area immediately." Panic rippled through the crowd. People started moving toward the exits in a disorganized scramble. My throat constricted as I processed her words. I bolted to the side, finding Thomas, who looked equally horrified. "Which house is it?" I shouted above the din. Thomas's response was lost in the clamor, but the sinking feeling in my gut told me exactly which home was in danger. I sprinted outside, my heart in my throat. Flames glowed ominously in the distance, illuminating the dark sky with an orange hue that made my stomach turn. A single thought consumed me. My family's beach house might be burning. The ocean breeze, normally soothing, now carried the acrid scent of smoke. Thomas caught up to me. "I think it's yours. I'm so sorry." His voice cracked with urgency. "You need to hurry." Without a second's hesitation, I raced toward my property. Adrenaline surged through my veins as the flickering light of the fire grew closer. By the time I reached the house, it was clear this was no accidental blaze. Flames licked the porch steps and the side walls, devouring the structure with terrifying speed. My lungs seized from the smoke. My eyes watered uncontrollably. Neighbors stood at a safe distance, some filming with their phones, too afraid to approach. Desperation took over. I yelled at anyone within earshot to call the fire department, though I could already hear the distant wail of sirens. I rushed to the side of the house, choking back tears at the sight of my father's old wooden steps collapsing into a swirl of flames. Someone tugged on my arm, urging me to stand back before the roof gave way. For a moment I felt powerless, watching pieces of my family legacy turn to ash. Then anger, raw and searing, ignited inside me. Without thinking, I moved toward the garden hose, hoping to at least slow the fire's spread. Thomas joined me, pulling me back when a fiery plank fell just feet away. The heat was unbearable. Sparks danced through the air, scalding my skin. We tried to douse the base of the flames, but they were too intense. A neighbor shouted to stay away, that the fire department would handle it. But the emotional bond I had with that house blinded me to reason. Memories of my father, my family gatherings, everything was in that building. My entire childhood flickered in those flames. Finally, the roaring engines arrived, and firefighters leaped into action, brandishing hoses that cast arcs of water onto the inferno. Another wave of adrenaline crashed over me. I stepped back, letting the professionals do their job, and scanned the crowd. My home was being destroyed, and I felt an almost surreal sense of detachment, as though this couldn't be happening. Then I saw Regina standing under a streetlight, her arms crossed. Her face was unreadable, illuminated by the reflection of the flickering fire. I glared at her, fury burning bright. She offered no comforting words, didn't even feign concern. She simply stared. For a moment I considered charging over to confront her, but there was no point. Let her watch. Let her see she'd made a grave error underestimating me. Pain lanced my chest as I realized something crucial. By orchestrating this fire, she'd crossed a line from petty intimidation into criminal violence, and now it was personal in a way she couldn't possibly fathom. The sun's first rays brought a harsh clarity to the devastation. My home was still smoldering, half of it reduced to blackened rubble. Firefighters continued to cool the remains, ensuring no lingering embers would reignite. Police had roped off the perimeter with bright tape. Smoke drifted skyward in curling plumes, a grim testament to how quickly a life's worth of memories can be turned to char. I'd barely slept. Official investigators combed through the debris looking for the cause of the blaze. While no formal findings were announced yet, the signs of accelerants and multiple ignition points hinted strongly at arson. Thomas stayed by my side, offering quiet support. A police officer, Detective Reed, approached us around mid-morning, stepping gingerly through the ash. He introduced himself and asked questions about potential enemies, suspicious sightings, and recent threats. I told him everything, not hiding my position as a state senator this time. My voice trembled with anger as I described Regina's repeated attempts at intimidation, culminating in last night's convenient conflagration. Detective Reed took detailed notes, his gaze keen with concern. "I'd like to see any documents you have linking the HOA to harassment or anything that might suggest a motive. This is serious, and we don't tolerate vigilantism." He looked pointedly at the wreckage. "If the HOA orchestrated this, they'll face serious charges." I handed over digital copies on a flash drive, photos, statements from neighbors, and records of suspicious HOA fines. Thomas contributed his own files. Reed assured us that the department would open an official investigation. Though it didn't alleviate the immediate heartbreak of losing my house, knowing the authorities were finally involved offered a glimmer of hope for justice. Meanwhile, word spread quickly through the community that the fire was anything but accidental. Neighbors who had previously kept silent started voicing their outrage. Within hours, my phone was flooded with calls and texts from people who'd once feared retribution but now felt compelled to come forward. Their collective frustration at the HOA's tyranny reached a boiling point. They wanted to rally together to demand an emergency meeting, to pressure the local government into action. I found myself juggling the roles of a victim, a community leader, and a politician. My staff caught wind of the situation and urged me to be cautious. According to them, it might look unseemly for a state senator to be embroiled in a local conflict. They advised I keep my distance and let the legal system handle it. But I refused to be sidelined. This wasn't just a PR inconvenience. This was my home, my father's legacy, and the place I'd hoped to retire someday. Later that day, I gathered with Thomas and a small circle of neighbors in what was left of my driveway. We formed a plan: hold a press conference, invite local media to expose what was happening, and show solidarity. A few people expressed concern that the HOA would retaliate further, but they were met with a resounding agreement that enough was enough. This final act of destruction had awakened something in the community, a collective resolve to fight back. That afternoon, as if on cue, one of the HOA board members, Jeremy Cole, reached out to Thomas privately. Jeremy was a junior member with no significant authority, but he'd always seemed uneasy about the board's heavy-handed tactics. He confessed, that he'd overheard Regina discussing teaching a lesson to me if I didn't cooperate. He hadn't known it involved fire until after the fact, but he felt complicit by remaining silent. Now his conscience was pricked, and he was willing to testify if it came to that. I met with Jeremy in a secluded spot near the charred remains of an old lifeguard station, far from prying ears. He looked pale, clutching a folder of documents that he claimed detailed internal HOA communications. His hands trembled as he handed them over. "Please," he said quietly, "I know I should have come forward sooner, but Regina is well connected and I was afraid. If you can protect me, I'll tell the police everything." Leafing through the documents, my eyes widened at the depth of the corruption. There were records of artificially inflated fines, statements about pressuring certain homeowners to sell their properties, and references to hush money paid to silence those who threatened legal action. Even more damning were references to upcoming real estate deals, suggesting collusion with out-of-state developers. If these documents were real, they constituted a smoking gun. I looked at Jeremy, weighing the gravity of the risk he'd taken. "I'll do everything in my power to protect you," I said solemnly. Meanwhile, Regina was conspicuously absent in the aftermath of the fire. Rumors swirled that she'd gone out of town or was hunkering down in her lavish estate on the other side of the peninsula. She hadn't released any public statement beyond a cursory expression of concern. The timing of her sudden disappearance only fueled suspicions about her involvement. Determined to capitalize on this pivotal moment, I arranged a small press briefing on the charred sand near my home's remains. Local reporters gathered in the late afternoon light, cameras capturing the sight of scorched walls and broken windows. I stood in front of the wreckage, my expression somber but resolute. Thomas and several other neighbors stood behind me, arms folded, faces set in grim determination. Speaking into the microphones, I laid bare the story, the relentless intimidation, the manipulative fines, the infiltration of greed into what should have been a simple homeowners association, culminating in the very real act of arson that nearly claimed my family's property. I revealed the evidence of corruption, not just from my own investigation, but also from Jeremy's leaked documents. A hush fell over the assembled press. This wasn't just gossip about some squabbling neighborhood group. It was a scandal involving a powerful HOA leader, potentially resorting to violence. As the cameras flashed, I felt a mix of rage and relief. Rage that my home was gone, relief that the truth was finally out. Local channels broadcast the story that evening. Social media lit up with angry reactions, community members sharing their own grievances, and condemnation of Regina's regime. The fallout was swift. Members of the HOA board started distancing themselves, releasing statements that they never condoned such extreme methods. A few even resigned preemptively, claiming ignorance of Regina's alleged plans. Simultaneously, Detective Reed escalated the police investigation to a higher priority. He interviewed Jeremy extensively, collecting a sworn statement. He also combed through the newly provided documents, cross-referencing them with the HOA's public records. A week earlier, I'd have preferred to keep my Senate position a secret to avoid complicating matters, but now it was an asset. The local authorities realized this situation demanded transparency and diligence to ensure it wouldn't spiral into a bigger political scandal. As all these events unfolded, I wrestled with personal grief each time I passed the burned husk of what was once my sanctuary. The flames had not only consumed decades of personal history, but also any illusions I might have harbored that local issues were somehow smaller or less critical than state-level politics. The heartbreak gave me fuel to push harder. One evening, a few days after the press briefing, Thomas and I sat on the beach near the water's edge. The tide caressed our feet as though trying to soothe the damage left behind. He glanced at me, concern and support mingling in his eyes. "You're doing the right thing," he murmured. "I just hope the cost isn't too high." I took a deep breath, looking out at the horizon where the ocean met the sky. I can't let them get away with this. My father always said, If you see injustice at your doorstep, you can't ignore it." My voice wavered slightly, but determination underpinned every syllable. News soon arrived that Regina had been sighted in her estate, which the local media had started referring to as her fortress. She wasn't granting interviews, and an assistant claimed she was recuperating from an illness. But behind closed doors, we suspected she was scrambling to cover her tracks. If she believed she could remain untouchable, she was mistaken. Her newfound caution confirmed she felt the walls closing in. A sense of anticipation spread through the neighborhood as the official investigation progressed. The turning point came when Detective Reed, backed by evidence from Jeremy's documents and statements from multiple homeowners, secured an arrest warrant for Regina. Local authorities, accompanied by law enforcement from nearby jurisdictions, arrived at her estate early one morning. The images of her being led away in handcuffs flashed across local TV news within the hour. Even then, she maintained a veneer of calm, issuing a statement through her lawyer that she was innocent and being framed by vindictive parties. Nevertheless, the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Investigators uncovered financial records suggesting she'd funneled HOA funds into her personal accounts, plus email exchanges that alluded to drastic measures against uncooperative residents. While the full truth of who lit the match that destroyed my home wasn't immediately clear, there was enough circumstantial evidence to prove the fire had been no accident. Regina's probable role in orchestrating it, or at least giving the order, was under intense scrutiny. In the days that followed, the remaining members of the HOA board tried to salvage what was left of the association's credibility. A temporary oversight committee took control, pledging to review and revise every policy. Fees and fines were frozen, and threatened foreclosures were halted indefinitely. For many in the neighborhood, it felt like a dark cloud had lifted. Though the legal process would take time, the tyranny of Regina's regime was effectively over. In the midst of this transition, I found myself standing before the ruins of my beach house one afternoon, joined by a small group of neighbors. Thomas was there, along with Linda, Mark, and a few others, who'd played pivotal roles in exposing the corruption. Despite the charred rubble behind us, there was an unmistakable sense of unity and hope. Someone brought a plate of homemade cookies, another brought coffee in thermoses, and for a moment we found solace in each other's company, grateful that the worst seemed behind us. I made arrangements with a local construction crew to clear out the debris, determined to rebuild. Though the cost would be steep, both financially and emotionally, I refused to let fear or intimidation chase me away from my own property. As we walked through the blackened remains, I found, miraculously, a metal picture frame that had somehow survived. Inside it was a partially scorched photograph of my father standing on the shore, the same image I'd looked at in my living room the night the HOA first came knocking. The edges were charred, but his face was intact, an unspoken reminder of the resilience he had instilled in me. In the weeks that followed, I balanced my legislative duties with overseeing the rebuilding project. My staff and I drafted proposals to strengthen regulations on homeowners associations statewide, ensuring that abuses of power like Regina's would be far more difficult in the future. I gave interviews, testified at city council meetings, and participated in public forums where I shared my experience. Eventually, Regina's trial began. Jeremy and several other board members testified against her in exchange for reduced penalties. The evidence presented made it clear that Regina orchestrated widespread malpractice, from financial mismanagement to direct threats against residents. Though the court would have the final say about the arson charge, the mounting proof made a strong case for her culpability. Each day, I attended the proceedings briefly before heading to my legislative work, confident that the judicial system would hold her accountable. On the final day of the trial, after all the damning testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Hours later, the verdict came. Regina was found guilty of multiple counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and complicity in the arson that destroyed my home. Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to relay the outcome, and Regina's usually composed expression gave way to something akin to disbelief. She turned to me, her eyes hard as steel, but said nothing. The gavel slammed down, sealing her fate. Walking out of the courthouse, I was met by a throng of cameras. A reporter asked how I felt now that justice had been served. I paused, considering the question. Justice meant more than punishing Regina. It meant setting a precedent so that others couldn't exploit their positions in the future. "It's a relief," I said, "but there's more work to be done. What happened here can't happen again." Within the neighborhood, the aftermath was a mix of relief and slow healing. The HOA was restructured, a new president was elected, someone with a background in community service who promised transparency and fair policies. Many residents who had been on the verge of losing their homes were able to work out reasonable payment plans or have their cases dismissed entirely. Little by little, the sense of community that Regina had tried to twist for her own ends began to mend. As for my house, the reconstruction was a labor of love. I refused to cut corners, insisting that every beam, every window, every door be installed with care. Friends and neighbors often pitched in, painting walls or sanding floors, eager to help restore not just the building, but the spirit it represented. After months of hard work, I stood on the newly built porch one evening, watching the sun dip into the horizon. The ocean breeze carried that familiar salting comfort, stirring memories of my childhood and all the moments I'd spent here. Thomas joined me, handing me a glass of lemonade. We clinked our glasses in a silent toast. "Feels right, doesn't it?" he asked, gazing at the sunset. "Yeah," I answered, breathing in the crisp sea air. "It does." A small gathering took place that night. Neighbors new and old converged on the beach by my home, bringing folding chairs, lanterns, and picnic baskets. Some offered homemade dishes, while others brought instruments, strumming gentle tunes that mingled with the lull of the waves. Children ran across the sand, laughing, free from the shadow that once loomed over our neighborhood. I stood with Thomas near a small bonfire, the orange glow reflecting in our eyes. "Guess you ended up on the board after all," he joked, gesturing to the newly formed committee that wanted me to serve as an advisor. I laughed softly, recalling how this all began. "I suppose I did in a roundabout way, but at least now it's a role worth having, and maybe I can ensure we don't repeat the mistakes of the past." In truth, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. The destructive fire had been the catalyst for our collective stand against corruption, reminding me that the personal and the political are often inseparable. Despite my high-profile position as a state senator, the fight that mattered most was the one right at my doorstep. Later, as the moon rose high and the party began to wind down, I wandered along the shoreline alone, listening to the ocean's unending rhythm. My father's spirit felt close in that moment, as though he was walking beside me, proud that I'd upheld our family's legacy by protecting our home and standing up for what was right. The memory of the house burning still stung, but in its place, a stronger community and a clearer sense of justice had emerged. If there was a lesson to be gleaned from it all, it was that power, whether wielded by an HOA president or a state senator, can be used to uplift or to oppress. Regina had chosen the latter, and she'd paid the price. I had chosen the former, ensuring that my influence served those who needed protection. The entire saga might have begun with a menacing knock at my door, but it ended with the proud rebuilding of more than just a house. We'd rebuilt trust, solidarity, and the integrity of our little piece of the shoreline. That night, long after everyone had gone, I stood on my new porch, the boards still smelling of fresh lumber. The moonlight lit the waves, their hushed roar a lullaby to my worn spirit. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply the coastal wind. Tomorrow the sun would rise on a different chapter, one where the community I cherished would remain safe from petty tyrants. Because no matter how desperate they became, no matter what lines they crossed, truth and integrity had proven their power once more.